Montana Territory, July 1881. The wind whipped across the high plains as Florence Nolan stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek with dust clinging to the hem of her traveling dress and doubt heavy in her chest. She clutched the letter tighter in her gloved hand, creased, smudged, and read too many times. The handwriting had been rushed. The words had been kind. But now, standing in this sun-bitten town with nothing but a suitcase and the ache of too many yesterdays, Florence was suddenly sure she had made a mistake. She had not meant to come here. Not really. Not until the train fare to Kansas City ran dry. Not until the boarding house in Cheyenne said she could not stay another night. Not until her sister's last letter said, "We are barely feeding the children as it is." She had stared at the envelope from Dry Creek for days before finally opening it. Inside had been 2 lines. "Florence, if you are tired of running, come here. I have room, no expectations, just come." Yate Kinley, she had known him once, a lifetime ago, before war and husbands and graves. But that was before, and this was now. She stepped down, eyes scanning the street. The town was little more than a few dusty buildings, a general store, a saloon, and a blacksmith hammering sparks into the air. Children scrambled in the alleyways, and a woman swept her porch with the weariness of someone who had not rested in years. Florence took a step forward and stopped. A tall man stepped out from beside the livery stable. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, dust on his boots, and a worn duster that snapped slightly in the breeze. His hair was dark, his jaw rough with days of growth, and his eyes, when they met hers, were soft with something that stopped her breath. He smiled, like he had been waiting forever. "Florence," he said, walking toward her like he had known exactly when she would arrive. "You came." She stared at him, heart thudding. "I thought," her voice caught, "I thought maybe I should not have." Yates stopped in front of her. He did not try to hug her. He did not touch her. He just looked at her like he was trying to remember every detail of her face all over again. "You did the right thing," he said, voice steady. "You are here. That is all that matters." He took her suitcase from her hands gently, like it was made of glass. She let him. He led her down the street, not talking much. He was not the boy she remembered from her father's fields back in Missouri before the war. That boy had been lean and restless. This man was quiet, grounded. His movements were sure. His silence did not feel empty. They crossed past the old church, past the dry well, and up a small rise to a house set back from the town. The house was plain, but the porch was swept, and flowers, real ones, grew out front. The door creaked as he opened it for her. Inside it was warm, lived in. A fire crackled in the stove, though the evening was still hot. "Upstairs, second door on the left," Yates said. "It is yours for as long as you need it." She turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I remember you," he said simply. "And because I know what it is like to lose everything and need a place to land." Florence swallowed the knot in her throat. "Thank you." He just nodded once and tipped his hat, then backed out the door. She stood in that quiet house for a long minute before going upstairs. The room was simple. A bed, a chair, a wash basin. A vase with fresh wildflowers sat on the windowsill. She sat on the bed and stared at them. By the time the sun had dipped behind the hills, she was on the porch, watching the sky bleed orange and red. Yate was there too, chopping wood with slow, even swings down by the shed. He glanced up once, then again when he saw her watching. "You hungry?" he called. She nodded. He cooked. Nothing fancy, beans, bread, and bacon, but it was hot and good, and she had not eaten anything that tasted like care in a long time. He did not ask about her husband, or the stillborn daughter, or the long road that had brought her here. He just passed her the bread and poured her water and sat beside her like he meant to stay there forever. That night, She lay awake in the quiet house, the open window letting in the night sounds crickets, the low howl of a coyote, the steady rhythm of wind through grass. And she thought of how he had looked at her, like it was not a mistake, like he had been waiting. She closed her eyes and let herself hope, just a little. The next morning she woke to the sound of a child crying. Florence sat up fast. That sound, high, scared, tore through her like lightning. She was down the stairs in seconds, barefoot on the creaking wood. In the kitchen stood Yate, holding a small boy who could not have been more than 4. His face was blotchy from tears, his tiny fists clutching Yates' shirt. Behind them, a girl, slightly older, maybe 6, stood silent and stiff, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Florence froze. Yate looked up. "Florence," he said, his voice low. "This is Thomas, and this is Tara." The boy hiccuped, burying his face in Yates' neck. Florence blinked. "Are they yours?" Yates shook his head. "No, their mama died in the winter. Their pa left them here 2 weeks ago." He looked at her, something raw in his eyes. "He is not coming back." Florence looked at the boy again, then the girl. The girl's eyes were sharp and guarded. The boy looked like he had cried himself sick. "And you just kept them?" she asked. Yate nodded. "I could not let them go to the orphan train." Florence stepped closer slowly. The girl flinched. "I lost a baby," Florence said, her voice almost too soft to hear. "She never even had a name." The girl's arms loosened slightly. Florence looked at Yate. "What do they need?" "Everything," he said, so she stayed. That morning stretched into a week. Then, too, Florence found herself brushing Tara's hair by the fire, teaching her how to sew a button. She found herself rocking Thomas to sleep on the porch swing when the night fears came. And every evening, Yate was there, quiet, steady, always watching her like she was something he had prayed for. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she stood beside him while he repaired the fence. Their hands brushed. She looked up at him, heart beating too fast. "I never thought I would feel safe again," she said. Yate turned to her slowly, eyes full of something deep and sure. "You are safe here," he said. "You always will be." And when he reached for her hand, she let him. The first frost came early that year, brushing the grass with silver and leaving the morning air sharp enough to sting the inside of Florence's nose. She rose before the sun, pulled on her shawl, and padded barefoot down the stairs, careful not to wake the children. The stove was cold, but the coals still held a faint glow. She fed them cedar kindling and coaxed the flame back to life. Yate was already outside. She saw him through the window, crouched by the chicken coop, one hand steadying the door while the other scattered feed. He moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who'd turned labor into habit, not performance. When he stood, the chickens fluttered around his boots, and his shoulders lifted once like he was breathing in the whole morning. Florence filled the kettle, set it over the fire, and began cutting slices from the last loaf. The bread was nearly stale, but Tara had helped bake it 3 evenings ago, and it still smelled of flour and wood smoke. She heard small footsteps overhead and the soft creak of the floorboards as Thomas stirred. By the time the sun broke over the hills, they were all sitting around the table. The children ate without fuss, cheeks pink from sleep. Yate passed Florence the butter without a word, their fingers brushing for the first time since the fence line evening. Later, when the children were out back piling leaves into crooked forts, Florence joined Yate by the barn. He was oiling the hinges on the tack room door, sleeves rolled past his elbows, the scent of linseed and leather thick in the air. "Your left shoulder's bothering you," she said. He tilted his head, not surprised. "Been acting up since last winter. Ice bucked me off near the river bend." "Does it keep you up?" "Only when I forget the weather's smarter than me." She leaned against the doorframe. "I could make a poultice. My mother used to use willow bark and comfrey for joint aches." He gave a slow nod. "If you've a mind to." I'd be grateful. They worked side by side through the rest of the morning. He mended straps while she sorted through the herb jars she'd unpacked but never touched. The rhythm settled between them, not forced, not hurried, just two people moving in time with the same quiet need. Later, they sat on the back porch while Tara read to Thomas from a tattered primer Yate had found in the church cellar. The boy leaned into her side, his thumb tucked stubbornly in his mouth, though no one scolded him for it. The girl's voice was steady, her brow furrowed with effort. Florence watched them, hands folded in her lap. Have you thought about school for them? Yates shifted, eyes on the horizon. Nearest one's 8 miles west, too far unless I can get a wagon repaired. You'll need someone to teach them until then. His gaze slid toward her. You offering, if you think they'd listen. Tara already does, he said. Thomas just needs time. She didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the grass and the scent of pine carried down from the ridgeline. I used to think I'd never be useful again, she said at last. You're wrong about that. Her throat tightened. I don't know what this is turning into. Neither do I, he said. But I'm not afraid of finding out. That night, after the children were asleep, Florence sat at the table darning one of Tara's stockings while Yate poured hot water into a chipped basin. She watched as he rolled up his sleeve and dipped the cloth in the poultice she'd made. Let me, she said. He hesitated, then nodded once. She stood behind him and pressed the warm compress to his shoulder. His skin was scarred, a thin line running from collarbone to shoulder blade, poorly healed. He didn't flinch when her fingers grazed it, but she felt the muscles tense beneath her touch. You were shot, she said, not a question. Near Franklin, he replied. Spring of '65. She didn't press further. Instead, she applied the compress, slow and steady, feeling the heat of him beneath her palm. After a while, he said, you don't have to stay if you ever feel the wind pulling you elsewhere. She looked at the scar again, then at his hands resting open on the table. I don't feel it pulling. Not anymore. He turned then, just enough to meet her eyes. I never expected you to come, he said. Not really, but when you stepped off that coach, it felt like something I'd been missing just walked back into place. She set the cloth aside and sat down across from him. I didn't come to be saved. I know that, he said. You came because you're strong enough to start over. Same reason I'm still here. They didn't touch again that night, but when she rose to blow out the lamp, he stood too and walked her to the stairs. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the hearth behind them. She turned at the top step. You sleep well, she said. You too, Florence. She lay in bed listening to the soft hush of wind through the eaves. There was a weight in her chest, but it wasn't sorrow. It was something quieter, something like belonging. By late September, the wind turned colder and the cottonwoods along the creek behind the house began to yellow. Florence had taken to gathering the children's laundry before sunrise, pinning the damp shirts and stockings to the line with her shawl wrapped high around her neck. The air bit at her fingers, but the routine steadied her. One afternoon, she and Tara sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting dried beans into chipped enamel bowls. The girl worked without needing to be told, her brow furrowed in concentration. Thomas napped in the corner, curled beneath a quilt that no longer smelled like mildew, but like rosemary and hearth smoke. Yate returned from town near dusk, his coat dusted with trail powder and his hat pulled low. He carried a narrow crate tucked under his arm. When Florence opened the door, he hesitated on the threshold. Wasn't sure if it was right to bring this here, he said, but I figured you'd know if it was. She stepped aside to let him in. What is it? He set the crate on the table and pulled back the lid. Inside sat a stack of bound paper, the edges worn and the covers faded from sunlight. She reached down, fingers brushing the top volume. Readers, she said aloud. You found primers. Elias from the Mercantile said they'd been collecting dust in the church basement since the war. Offered them for nothing if I'd haul out the broken pews next week. Florence turned a few pages, the corners smudged with ink and time. These'll do. Yates studied her hands as they moved across the pages. You still write, not since Missouri. The last letter I sent never made it past the post. You could start again. She didn't answer immediately. Her thumb rested on the margin of a lesson about rivers and trade routes. I don't know what I'd say, she said. Except that I'm not who I was when I left home. He pulled out a chair and sat, the light from the stove catching the lines around his eyes. That might be the very thing worth writing down. They were quiet after that, the kind of quiet that settled without weight. Florence gathered the books and stacked them neatly. Tara came in from the yard with a bundle of dried corn husks under her arm, cheeks flushed and hair sticking to her forehead. She set them beside the stove without a word and began helping Thomas out of his shoes, her small hands practiced. That evening, after the children were put to bed, Yates stayed seated at the table while Florence boiled water for tea. The flame under the kettle hissed faintly, and the glow from the stove painted the walls amber. I was offered land once, he said, his voice low. Back in Arkansas. Government acreage for veterans, I gave it up. She stirred the leaves in their cups. Why? Didn't feel like a place to build something real, just dirt and ghosts. She passed him his tea. And here, he looked at her then, eyes steady. Here feels like it could hold. She sat across from him, both hands around her cup. You ever think about what would have happened if we'd met again sooner? Often enough, he said. But I don't think we'd have been ready, not then. Florence nodded slowly. I used to imagine a version of myself that hadn't been broken in so many places, but she wouldn't have known what to do with this life, or these children. You know what they need, he said. You see it before they ask. She traced the rim of her cup. Some days I still wake up expecting it all to be gone. He reached across the table, his hand resting palm up beside hers. He didn't move to take it, just let it be there, waiting. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Her fingers found his, slow and certain. She didn't speak, but she held on. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of their lives deepened. Florence began lessons for the children beside the hearth, using the primers and drawing lessons in charcoal on old feed sacks stretched flat. Tara picked up numbers quickly, while Thomas spent more time watching the birds outside the window than the letters on the page. Still, he stayed close, and when he laughed, it came from deep in his belly, sudden and full. One morning, the hinges on the front gate gave out. Yate hauled them off with a grunt, muttering about rust and poor welds. Florence joined him in the yard with a tin of boiled linseed and a rag. You could have told me, she said, dabbing the oil along the new hinges. You had your hands full. I always have my hands full. He looked up from the posts. I like you that way. She straightened, wiping her fingers on her apron. Careful, that almost sounded like something. He stood, brushing sawdust from his trousers. Might have been. They stood there, the gate swinging gently between them. The light slanted through the trees, catching the gold in her hair and the dark in his eyes. I never thought I'd want all this again, she said. A home. A man beside me. I'm not just beside you, Florence. She stepped forward, the gate swinging closed behind her. I know. He reached for her waist then, slow, like asking permission in the space between their hearts. She leaned in, and when his lips met hers, it was not desperate or hurried. It was steady, like how the wind carries the scent of rain before it falls. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. We're not rushing this, she said. No, he murmured. We're just finally catching up. And with the gate fixed and the sun warming the porch behind them, they went inside together. By mid-October, the first snow dusted the far ridges, clinging to the pines in soft white bands. The days shortened, and the mornings stiffened with frost. Florence began pulling the heavy quilts from the cedar chest in the loft, shaking out the scent of dried lavender and age. When she opened the small drawer beneath, she found a folded square of muslin embroidered with her mother's initials, thread faded, but stitches neat as ever. She smoothed it over her lap, fingers brushing the edge. "She used to keep this in her apron pocket," she said aloud. Yate, standing in the doorway with wood stacked in his arms, set it down slowly. "Was she kind?" Florence nodded, but didn't speak right away. "She had a gentleness that didn't need proving. When our mule broke its leg, she sat beside it in the field until the light left its eyes. Didn't say a word. Then she dug the hole with my father." Yates stepped closer, resting one hand lightly against the doorframe. "You're like that." She folded the cloth and tucked it away. "Sometimes I wonder if I remember her true or just how I needed her to be. I reckon it's both." That evening, Florence heard Tara humming in the kitchen while scrubbing potatoes with a stiff, bristled brush. The girl had taken to doing small tasks without being asked, quietly watching how Florence moved through the house and copying her with a focus that never asked for praise. "You miss your mother?" Florence asked gently, dipping the stew ladle into the pot. Tara didn't look up. "She used to sing when she was sweeping. I remember that more than her face." Florence nodded. "That counts." Outside, the wind had picked up. Florence could hear it bending the bare branches against the side of the house. She pulled the kettle from the stove and poured water into a basin set near the hearth, steam rising in soft curls. Later, as the children sat curled together with their primer, Florence stepped out onto the porch with a shawl over her shoulders. Yates stood near the corral, one boot propped on the lower rail, hat in his hands. "I've been thinking about building a lean-to," he said without turning. "For the wagon. Snow'll rot the undercarriage if I leave it out." She stepped down beside him. "I can help you draw the plans." He glanced at her, one brow raised. "You draw?" "My father was a millwright. He taught me how to read blueprints before I knew how to hem a skirt." "Well," he said, settling his hat back on his head, "that explains the clean angles on that chicken pen fix you did." They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the horses shift in the half-light. One of the mares snorted quietly, her breath a silver cloud in the air. "I got a letter from my younger brother," Florence said after a moment. "He's up in Helena now. Said he heard from someone I made it out west." Yate didn't speak, but his stillness deepened. "He asked if I planned to return. Said he could help me find work near the city." "What do you want?" Yate asked, his voice low. She turned to him fully. "I want to stay. I want to see Tara learn her letters without biting the end of her pencil in frustration. I want to hear Thomas laugh when he finds another beetle in the kindling pile. I want to wake up in this house with the wind rattling the windows and feel like it belongs to me too." Yate looked at her then, not with surprise, but with something deeper in acceptance that had been waiting its turn. "You already belong here," he said. "You did the minute you stepped off that coach." She reached out, her fingers curling around the front of his coat. "Then tell me this is ours. Not just something I'm borrowing until the weather turns." He took her face in both hands, rough palms warm against her cheeks. "It's ours, Florence. All of it. The quiet, the work, the cold mornings, the long nights. I want every part of it with you." She stood on her toes and kissed him again, slower than before, with nothing held back. When they parted, she rested her forehead to his, breath mingling in the cold. "I never thought I'd be chosen again," she whispered. "You weren't chosen," he said. "You were waited for." Inside, the fire crackled low and Tara's voice rose in a whisper, trying to sound out a long word. Florence heard Thomas giggle at her mistake, then the soft thump of the primer hitting the floor. Yates stepped back, lacing his fingers through hers. Come on. Let's go remind them bedtime means quiet. Florence smiled, and together they walked back toward the porch, hand in hand, into the warmth of the home they were building, one silent moment, one steady vow at a time. The last of the carrots came up stunted that year, but Florence didn't mind. She brushed the soil from their crooked shapes and lined them on the windowsill to dry, sun catching on the orange skin like embers. The earth had hardened early, and by the end of October, the ground froze solid each night. Yate added a layer of straw in the coop and patched the northern wall of the barn with pine boards salvaged from the old schoolhouse siding. Inside, the house took on the hush of winter settling in. Florence hemmed wool trousers for Thomas from an old coat, while Tara practiced stitching rows of thread through muslin squares. Every evening, they lit a single lamp and sat close to the fire, the quiet broken only by the scrape of a chair leg or the occasional sigh from the sleeping hound Yate had taken in from a trapper weeks earlier. One night, as wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, Florence found Yate at the kitchen table with a folded paper spread in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "What is it?" she asked, knotting her shawl tighter. He straightened slowly. "Land title. County clerk rode through this morning, said it's time to sign or let it go." She stepped closer, eyeing the document. "You plan to keep it?" "I was waiting to ask you." She sat, hands resting flat on the table. "This house already feels like it's ours." "Paper or not," he nodded, jaw tight. "But if we sign it, then we build on it, make it more than a place to catch our breath." Florence tilted her head, studying him. "What are you asking?" He met her eyes steady. "I want to raise them with you. I want to plant next spring knowing you'll be beside me. I want to go to sleep knowing your name's tied to this place like mine." She didn't answer right away. The fire snapped in the hearth and the wind slipped through the chinks in the window frame. Then her voice came soft but sure. "Then we sign it. Together." They rode into town the next morning, the children bundled in wool and tucked in the back of the wagon with a hot stone wrapped in flour sacks between them. The clerk's office was cold, the windows fogged from breath and weather, but Florence's hand didn't shake as she pressed her name alongside Yates. On the way back, Tara leaned against Florence's side and asked if they could plant blackberry bushes in the spring. Florence ran her hand over the girl's hair, already thinking of where the sun hit best near the fence line. By December, the house held warmth even on the coldest days. Florence found herself humming without realizing it while kneading bread or brushing the children's hair. Yates spent his evenings carving a small rocking horse from pine, shaping it with careful strokes when Thomas wasn't watching. The week before Christmas, Yate returned from a trip to the mill with a wrapped bundle tucked under his coat. He handed it to Florence without ceremony, one brow raised in question. Inside was a length of blue calico, the shade deep as twilight. She ran her fingers over it, heart catching. "I saw how you looked at that bolt back in August," he said. "Didn't have the coin then." Florence set the fabric gently on the table, then reached for his hand. "You remember everything." "I remember you," he said. "That's all I need." On Christmas morning they woke early, the children tumbling down the stairs with sleep-warm faces and wide eyes. Yate lit the fire while Florence stirred cornmeal into the pot. They didn't have much, but there were gifts wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. A book for Tara, a carved whistle for Thomas, a scarf Yate had never seen her working on until he opened it with both hands. Later, with the snow falling soft outside and the house filled with the scent of cider and pine, Yate pulled Florence aside near the back door. "I have one more thing," he said. He held out a ring, plain gold, the band worn smooth. "It was my mother's. She wore it through every hard season." Florence touched it, then looked up at him. "You sure? I want you to wear it through every good one." She didn't answer, just slipped it on her finger and leaned into his chest. He held her there, and neither said anything more. Spring came slow, but it came. The snow melted into the creek, and the fence line thawed enough to drive in new posts. Florence planted blackberry starts by the eastern wall, just where the sun found them in late morning. One afternoon, while Thomas napped and Tara braided twine into a jump rope, Florence stood beside Yate in the field behind the barn. "This land's going to hold a lot of stories," she said. "It already does." She looked up at him, the wind tugging her hair loose from its pins. "Yate Kinley, there is no place I'd rather begin again." He kissed her then, right there with the creek running behind them and the wind rolling soft across the hills. It wasn't hurried and it wasn't the first, but it was the one that meant forever. They built a life from that kiss, quiet mornings, long work, laughter tangled in with the ache of remembering. They didn't seek grand things, just honest ones. They raised the children with steady hands, taught them to read, to mend, to listen. And when the years turned, they faced them side by side. The house stood through storm and thaw and drought. The blackberry bushes grew thick and sweet. And every winter, Florence found a new way to stitch warmth into the seams of their world. She never left again. Not once. And Yate never stopped waiting, even once he had her. They grew old in that house, the two of them, wrapped in the kind of love that doesn't shout or burn, it holds.